Hello and welcome to the 28th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is the European Commission's proposed 2040 climate law amendment, a plan that would legally bind the European Union to cut its net greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by the year 2040 compared to 1990 levels. Now, that's a hefty goal and a mouthful of policy speak, but fear not. We're going to unpack what this 2040 target really means in this part one of a two-part mini-series, why it matters right now in 2025, and how it could reshape everything from how Europeans get their energy to how they travel, manufacture goods, grow food, and even how businesses plan for the future. First off, let's clarify what the 2040 target entails. In plain language, the European Commission wants the EU as a whole to slash its greenhouse gas emissions to just 10% of what they were in 1990, and to do it by 2040. That's only 15 years from now. If you recall, the EU already has a 2030 climate target, a 55% reduction, and a long-term goal of climate neutrality by 2050, essentially 100% net reduction. This new 2040 target sits in between, like a high bar raised for the midterm. Why 90%? Well, EU scientists advised aiming in the range of 90 to 95% to stay on track for the Paris Agreement's temperature goals. 90% is at the lower end of that recommended range, a politically pragmatic figure, but still extremely ambitious. It means that by 2040, Europe would be almost at net zero emissions, leaving only a small residual to eliminate or offset by 2050. In essence, the continent needs to eliminate the vast majority of fossil fuel use and other greenhouse emissions within the next decade and a half. That's massive. For perspective, the EU today, in 2025, has cut emissions by around 30% since 1990. Over the next 15 years, it's aiming to chop off another 60 percentage points. We're talking about doubling down and then doubling down again on climate action. After all, 2040 sounds far away, and politicians love making promises for future leaders to fulfill. But this target matters immediately because it changes the trajectory and the sense of urgency. Think of it like setting a tough halfway point on a marathon. It forces you to run faster now, so you're not scrambling at the end. By cementing a 90% by 2040 goal in law, the EU is sending a strong signal to governments, industries, investors, and citizens that the pace of decarbonisation must accelerate starting today. Projects and policies that might have been slated for the 2040s will need to happen in the 2030s, or even this decade. It matters now also because of global context. Later this year, at the COP30 Climate Summit in Brazil, the EU wants to show it's serious about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Having a firm 2040 target is part of that credibility. And, as we speak, Europe is experiencing more frequent extreme weather, scorching heat waves, droughts, wildfires, reminders of why later isn't good enough. Locking in a 2040 goal is Europe's way of saying, we know 2050 is the ultimate finish line, but we can't hit snooze until the 2040s to wake up. Before we dive into sectors and countries, let's talk politics. Because in the EU, even the noblest climate goal involves rounds of political arm wrestling. The European Commission's announcement of 90% by 2040 didn't emerge from a vacuum. It followed months of wrangling behind closed doors among the 27 member states. Picture a long table in Brussels with representatives from each country debating percentages and conditions late into the night, coffee cups and maybe a few stress balls on the table. Indeed, the Commission had originally flirted with an even tougher stance. The expert advice was, as I mentioned, up to 95% and strictly domestic emissions cuts only. But some national governments balked at that. Several member states found 90% plus without any outside help a bit too ambitious or too costly for comfort. So, to avoid a total showdown, the Commission introduced a dose of flexibility in the final proposal. They said, fine, we'll stick with the 90% headline cut, but we'll allow a small slice of that to be met through carbon credits and offsets, and we'll build in other flexibilities across sectors and countries. In EU policy terms, that's basically adding a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. Essentially, up to 3% out of that 90% reduction could potentially be achieved by funding carbon-cutting projects outside Europe or through carbon removal projects, rather than purely cutting emissions at the source within the EU. In practice, that might mean things like investing in reforestation or renewable projects in developing countries and counting those emission savings toward the EU's goal, or using technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and count that. This was a controversial concession. Environmental groups immediately cried foul, calling it a loophole big enough to drive a diesel truck through. Some even warn it shifts responsibility onto poorer countries. Not a good look for a bloc that prides itself on climate leadership and equity. Several governments and industry voices pushed hard for this flexibility, and for understandable reasons from their perspective. Take Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse. The German government was reportedly adamant that a bit of wiggle room via high-quality carbon credits should be part of the package. Why? Because Germany has some sectors, heavy manufacturing, chemical production and so forth, that are notoriously hard to decarbonise quickly. In Berlin's view, allowing up to 3% of reductions through carefully vetted offsets after 2036 gives their industries a safety valve for the toughest last stretch, without significantly diluting the overall effort. As one official put it, with a logic only a technocrat could love, the atmosphere doesn't care where a ton of CO2 is cut, as long as it's cut. Of course, many scientists respond that this logic only holds if those offsets are real and verifiable. A big if, judging by the checkered history of carbon credits. You can see the fault lines. Some EU members and lawmakers wanted 100% domestic cuts by 2040. No excuses. Others said, let's be pragmatic. 90% domestic and a sprinkle of credits is fine. The Compromise Commission proposal reflects the latter view, likely because it was the only way to get broad buy-in. Notably, this compromise aligns with Germany's stance almost to the letter. No coincidence there. While climate progressive voices, from Scandinavian countries or the European Parliament's Green Bloc, for example, are a bit disappointed, and countries with more reservations are relieved. Speaking of reservations, even France, usually a champion of ambitious climate action, had some hesitations. French President Emmanuel Macron, with support from Poland of all places, floated the idea of delaying the agreement on the 2040 target. Now, France's reasons differ from Poland's. Poland has a heavily coal-dependent economy and tends to urge caution, or more money, every time the EU raises climate ambition. France is already relatively low carbon in electricity thanks to nuclear power, but it has other considerations. For instance, ensuring that nuclear energy's role is recognised and that its industries and farmers, an influential group in France, aren't hit too abruptly. By pairing with Poland's call to slow down, France signalled that it wanted a careful discussion of the target's implications and perhaps certain guarantees. In classic EU fashion, these initial hesitations set the stage for horse trading. The final proposal was framed as ambitious but flexible to ease French and Polish concerns. If you think getting 27 countries to unanimously agree on dinner is hard, try getting them to agree on a generation-defining climate goal, with everyone claiming their recipe is the only palatable one. All right, political drama aside for a moment, let's turn to the meat of this issue, the sector-by-sector transformation that a 90% reduction target implies. Because at the end of the day, cutting emissions means changing how practically everything works, especially in key sectors of the economy. The first and most crucial sector is the sustainable energy sector. If the EU is to hit 90% less emissions, the energy sector will have to do a lot of the heavy lifting, arguably the most of any sector. Why? Because energy production, power plants, the grids, fuel refining, etc., not only produces a big chunk of emissions on its own, but it's also the key to reducing emissions in other sectors through electrification. This transformation under a 2040 horizon relies on renewables, and more renewables, plus a strong dash of energy efficiency and some supporting tech. By 2040, Europe will need to have almost completely phased out unabated fossil fuels in power generation. Coal, which is already on the way out, will be history well before then. Many EU countries plan to shut their last coal plants by 2030 or shortly after. A few laggards might hold on a bit longer, but under a 90% target, there's really no room for coal's high emissions. Natural gas, which has been a tougher nut to crack because it's been considered a bridge fuel, will also need a dramatic decline, either replaced by cleaner alternatives or equipped with carbon capture technology if any gas is left by 2040. Realistically, only a small residual of gas power might remain, perhaps with carbon capture or used sparingly for balancing the grid in winter peaks. The lion's share of electricity will need to come from zero-carbon sources, chiefly wind and solar, with contributions from hydro, nuclear, for those countries that have it, and emerging technologies like geothermal or ocean energy where available. The EU has already been ramping up renewable energy capacity, but hitting this target means shifting to an even higher gear. Think massive new offshore wind farms in the North Sea and the Baltic, vast solar fields across the sunnier parts of Europe, and millions of solar panels on rooftops from Dublin to Dubrovnik. We're talking about a near total makeover of the power system in 15 years. It's a huge challenge, but also a massive opportunity, the kind that gets energy companies and tech innovators excited, and perhaps keeps fossil fuel execs up at night. Grids will need to be expanded and upgraded too. More high-voltage power lines crisscrossing the continent to move all that green energy to where it's needed, better connections between countries, so that, say, when Spain's excess solar power is available, it can be sent to Germany, or when Sweden's wind is blowing hard, it lights up Italian homes. We need smarter grids as well, using digital tech to balance variable wind and solar supply with demand in real time. And energy storage solutions will have to go mainstream. Everything from big battery farms to hydroelectric storage, like Switzerland's alpine reservoirs, to potentially green hydrogen to store excess power from windy, sunny days and use it later. One often underappreciated aspect is how energy security and independence tie in. The Commission has been touting that slashing emissions is not just good for the climate, it's also a way to stop depending on imported fossil fuels. Looking at you, Russian gas, which Europe painfully weaned itself off in recent years. So, the 2040 climate push doubles as an energy sovereignty push. More homegrown renewable energy means less exposure to global oil and gas price swings, and less money sent abroad for fuel. As Climate Commissioner Wopke Hoekstra quipped recently, Europe is doing it for competitiveness, for climate, and for our independence. A bold claim, and it will certainly take a lot of investment to realise it, but not an unrealistic one given the trajectory of renewable technology costs and recent lessons learned about energy security. Now, a quick aside on nuclear power, since I mentioned it, and it's always a hot topic in Europe. Nuclear is low carbon, so one might think it'd be a no-brainer for hitting emission targets. France, for example, relies heavily on nuclear and is planning to build new reactors, arguing that they provide steady, carbon-free power to complement renewables. Other countries, like Germany, have taken the opposite route. Germany just shuttered its last nuclear plants in 2023, focusing on renewables and efficiency instead. The EU's climate law doesn't dictate which technologies countries must use, so nuclear's role will be determined nationally. But the debates around it feed into EU politics. France leads a pro-nuclear camp seeking recognition for nuclear as a climate solution, and even counting nuclear-based hydrogen as green, whereas others are skeptical. Green hydrogen stands to shift from promising niche to linchpin technology under a 90% by 2040 emissions regime. The legally binding target effectively prices grey hydrogen out of the market by mid-next decade, making renewable-powered electrolysis the default feedstock for ammonia, steel, and refinery operations that survive the transition. Brussels will lean on its new hydrogen bank, carbon contract for difference instruments, and looser state aid rules to accelerate investment, while the rising ETS price and looming carbon border tariff ensure demand. For hard-to-abate sectors such as German steel or French heavy transport, green hydrogen becomes less a climate gesture and more an existential supply chain hedge. Secure it or watch competitors claim the low carbon premium. Expect hundreds of gigawatts of electrolyzer orders over the next 15 years, alongside a race to finance storage caverns, port terminals, and retrofitted pipeline corridors. Geography dictates winners and fast followers. Iberia, blessed with abundant solar and wind, suddenly looks like the Gulf Coast of Europe. Spain's mega solar basins and Portugal's Atlantic offshore wind farms can churn out cheap electrons for electrolysis, funneled north via projects like H2Med. Germany eyes those molecules to keep Rhine land furnaces hot, while France lobbies Brussels to count nuclear-based pink hydrogen alongside green, widening its export play. In short, the 2040 law doesn't just encourage green hydrogen, it hard-codes it into Europe's industrial survival strategy, rewarding regions that can scale fast and penalising those that stall. Next up on our sector tour, transportation, how Europeans move people and goods around. Transportation is one of the largest sources of emissions in Europe. Think cars, trucks, planes, ships. And unlike power generation, transport emissions have been stubborn to reduce until recently. But the 2040 target will force a revolution on wheels, rails, and wings. In fact, it's already underway. Perhaps the most visible change is the rise of the electric vehicle. The EU has set in motion a law to effectively ban sales of new gasoline and diesel cars by 2035, with a tiny loophole for e-fuel niche vehicles, but essentially, it's full speed ahead for electric cars. That means by 2040, virtually every new car on the road will be electric or hydrogen-powered. It's a signal to the auto industry and mobility sector that there's no going back. If any car company was still dreaming of a comeback for gas guzzlers, that dream is now as dead as a dodo. But transportation is not just personal cars. Trucks and freight must clean up too, perhaps an even trickier challenge. We're already seeing the start of electric trucks and buses, and the EU is tightening CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles as well. By the 2030s, we'll see a lot more zero-emission trucks, likely battery electric for shorter hauls, and possibly hydrogen fuel cells for longer hauls, where charging a huge battery might be impractical. There's also a push for more freight to shift onto electric trains, where possible, since rail is far cleaner than diesel trucks. In cities, expect more investments in public transport, cycling infrastructure, and even things like electric scooters, all part of lowering transport emissions and improving air quality. And here's a subtle but important thing. As road transport electrifies, the energy and transport sectors become intertwined. charging millions of vehicles will hugely increase electricity demand. Aviation and shipping, the globetrotters of the transport world, will be tougher nuts to crack. By 2040, short hop flights inside Europe might be fewer if the EU succeeds in making rail a more attractive alternative for, say, a Paris to Barcelona trip. But planes will still be necessary for longer distances and intercontinental travel. The EU is nudging aviation with measures like blending mandates for sustainable aviation fuels (SAFs), basically requiring planes to use a mix of kerosene and biofuels or synthetic e-fuels that have lower life cycle emissions. By 2040, we might see some hybrid or small electric planes for regional routes, but big jets will probably still mostly burn liquid fuel, hopefully a greener version of it. The climate law's pressure means airlines and manufacturers are investing in cleaner tech now. Otherwise, they'll face either heavy carbon costs or even restrictions. Shipping, similarly, is starting to experiment with cleaner fuels. Some ships testing ammonia or methanol or using electric battery ferries on shorter routes. The EU has brought shipping into its carbon pricing system and is promoting green maritime fuels. By 2040, if all goes to plan, the dirtiest bunker fuels might be largely phased out in European ports, replaced by cleaner alternatives. Now, let's dive into the manufacturing and industrial sector, another big pillar of the EU economy and a key source of emissions. This one is complex because it covers everything from steel mills and cement factories to chemical plants, machinery, and even textiles and electronics manufacturing. But the main climate culprits in industry are the heavy industries: steel, cement, chemicals, aluminium, basically processes that either consume a ton of energy or inherently produce CO2, like making cement releases CO2 from limestone. Decarbonising these is vital for a 90% overall cut, but it's tough technically and economically. Europe's industries have been around for a long time. Many factories still use fossil fuels like coal, coke, oil, or natural gas for heat or feedstock. The 2040 goal effectively says, retool or reinvent these processes within 15 years. No small feat. Recognising that challenge, the EU isn't just saying, thou shalt decarbonise, and leaving it at that. Alongside the 2040 target, Brussels rolled out what it calls a clean industrial deal, essentially a package to help industry transform. This includes financial incentives, for example, loosened state aid rules, so governments can subsidise green industrial projects more easily, and EU-wide funding pots for innovation. Regulatory support, like simplifying the rules under the new Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, so that if EU industries face carbon costs, foreign competitors importing into Europe have to pay equivalent carbon tariffs, thereby preventing carbon leakage, where production would just move overseas to avoid regulation, and even tax breaks for clean tech investments. The idea is to shield and propel European industry into the green era rather than let it decline or offshore due to climate policies. The 2040 target basically lights a timer under industrial strategy: innovate or become obsolete. And Europe's major industrial countries, notably Germany, but also Italy, France, Spain, and others, are keenly aware of this. We expect a wave of R&D and capital spending in the next years. Things like hydrogen production facilities, CCS projects, electrified high-temperature furnaces, recycling systems, you name it. An industrial revolution for the climate age. Two complicating and imperative factors here are competitiveness and supply chains. European industries don't operate in a vacuum. They compete with the US, China, and others. The US, under climate skeptic-in-chief Donald Trump and a Republican-led Congress, has hammered a final nail into the coffin of its Biden-era Inflation Reduction Act via the passage last week of the Big, Beautiful Bill. Where is Orwell when you need him? So, the EC 2040 climate law is really a doubly bold statement from a continent travelling in the opposite direction to the US. As it raises the bar on what European industries must achieve, the EU must ensure its companies aren't left at a disadvantage. Measures like the CBAM carbon tariff are intended to level the playing field. Basically, if European steel must bear carbon costs and Indian or Russian steel doesn't, a tariff at the EU border would charge the difference so foreign producers don't get a free ride. All right, moving on to another key slice of the pie, agriculture. And let's include land use in this discussion. Agriculture is a smaller share of emissions compared to energy or transport, but it's significant and one of the toughest areas to decarbonise deeply. The emissions here come from a variety of sources: methane from livestock, cows belching, manure management, yes, greenhouse gases even come from cow digestion, nitrous oxide from soils, from fertiliser use, and some CO2 from machinery and land clearing. The 2040 target encompasses all sectors, so agriculture too must find ways to cut emissions, potentially by quite a lot. But you can't electrify a cow or stick a catalytic converter on a rice paddy. Many agricultural emissions are biological byproducts, which means we need to change practices and maybe even what we produce and consume. Under a 90% reduction scenario, realistically, other sectors might compensate more so that agriculture could be, say, only 50% or so reduced by 2040, because eliminating 90% of farm emissions is extremely hard without fundamentally altering diets and farming systems. Still, there's room to improve. European farmers can adopt more climate-friendly practices. For livestock, innovations like special feed additives can reduce methane emitted by cows. Some studies show certain compounds, or even a bit of seaweed in cattle feed, can cut their methane output significantly. Perhaps the cows won't notice the gourmet kelp added to their menu. Better manure storage and use can capture methane for energy biogas and prevent emissions. On fertilisers, more precise application and alternative farming techniques, like planting cover crops, improving soil health, can cut down nitrous oxide release. There's also the potential to breed more efficient animals or crops that produce less waste. Crucially, agriculture intersects with carbon sinks. Farms and forests cover much of Europe, and how that land is managed can either release carbon or absorb it. The EU has separate targets for the land use sector, the LULUCF, land use change and forestry, in EU jargon, which sets how much carbon should be absorbed by natural sinks like forests and soils. Under the new climate proposal, they are giving more flexibility between these sink targets and emission targets. In practice, if a country can absorb more CO2 in its forests or wetlands, it could count that towards meeting its overall goal. That's helpful for more rural countries with lots of forest, say Finland or Portugal. But some environmentalists worry it could let countries postpone cutting actual emissions by leaning too much on forestry offsets. It's a tricky balance. You want to incentivize restoring forests and better land management, but not as an excuse to keep an old coal plant running longer. The 2040 plan tries to thread the needle by encouraging natural carbon sinks while still pushing every sector to do its part. Well, that's a wrap on our 28th GreenWave podcast episode. We're growing the pod with the support of you, our loyal listeners, and it's been great delving into this critical topic together. We'll be back with part 2 next week. You can stream the pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM, so feel free to follow us and share with friends. We'd love if you would leave a 5-star review. Your feedback is becoming more important as our audience grows. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.